5 of Talking Point on Wisp Sports Radio, where we delve more deeply into some of the systemic barriers facing women in sport. Talking Point is co-produced by myself and Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Lisa Ingarfield, and at Wisp Sports, we believe women in sport deserve equal coverage. Last month in episode 4, we talked to Laura Ockman, Fox Sports, NFL, and sports broadcaster and founder of Galvanize. We chatted about the marginalization of women in sports media, both in terms of opportunity and treatment. This week, we're extremely lucky to be joined by Dr. Mary Jo Kane, who heads up the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport, based out of the University of Minnesota. We'll be talking about how sport can be a site of resistance and empowerment for women, and how this potential is often consciously and unconsciously contained by a male-run sports industry seeking to maintain its dominance in sport. Mary Jo Kane is professor and director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. She received her PhD from the University of Illinois with an emphasis in sports sociology. Professor Kane is an internationally recognized scholar who has published extensively on media representations of women's sports. She's also one of the nation's leading experts on the social and political implications of Title IX. Welcome, Dr. Kane, to this episode of Talking Point. We're really happy to have you join us this month.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have been invited.
So I was wondering if we could just begin with, if you wouldn't mind sharing with our audience a little bit about what you do and the work of the Tucker Center, and perhaps share a little bit about some of the current projects you're all working on.
Okay. Well, this is my close to 30th year at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I am a faculty member in the School of Kinesiology, whose emphasis as a sports sociologist has been mostly on sport, media, and gender. And in addition to my role as a faculty member, I am also the director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport. And we are housed in the College of Education and Human Development. Excuse me. And we remain the first and only one of its kind, meaning a research center that in a Research One university devoted solely to how sport and physical activity impact the lives of girls and women, their families, and their communities. And the reason that it's called the Tucker Center is that it's named after our primary benefactor, a woman named Dorothy Tucker, who died this last August, but who was a 1945 graduate of the University of Minnesota and someone who cared deeply about being a pioneer and providing funds so that we could conduct research, attract graduate students, and engage in a master's thesis, a dissertation that was related to some aspect of girls' involvement in sport and physical activity. And this, as we approach 2019, it will be the 25th anniversary of the Tucker Center. I have been the only director. Dr. Nicole Lavoie, some of your listeners may know of her because of the work she's done on women in sport leadership. Dr. Lavoie is the co-director. And most of the research that we've done over the years has focused either on my research, which I think we'll get into a little bit later, which is how media covers women's sports versus how they cover men's sports. And what Dr. Lavoie looks at is the dramatic decline of women in leadership positions at the collegiate level 2 decades after the passage of Title IX in 1972. So that's, in a nutshell, who we are and what we do.
And there was a recent, I believe there was a recent document that came out related to women coaching in the NCAA, and that the numbers of women coaches are still minuscule comparative to men. Is that right?
Correct. The great irony of Title IX, and for all the critics of Title IX who say that it has certainly helped women, but it has hurt men and men's sports, the great irony and unintended consequence of Title IX is the dramatic decline of women in leadership roles within women's athletics. So, for example, prior to Title IX nationwide, over 90% of all head coaches in women's sports were female. Today, nationwide, only 43% of all head coaches in women's sports are female. And one of the things that we've looked at in the Tucker Center is why would that be the case? And what we have argued, along with other scholars around the country, is that as women's sports came online, because universities had to, respond to Title IX guidelines, meaning you can't discriminate in educational institutions on the basis of gender. So if you have a men's athletic program, you better have a women's athletic program. And I think what happened is that we went from sort of a model of volunteering, where women physical educators would get an extra maybe $1,000 a year to be the coach of the women's volleyball team. As universities knew they had to get serious, quote unquote, about women's sports and enter the big time, quote unquote, they decided that the real coaches were men. And so what has happened, rather ironically, in the wake of Title IX, is that with respect to employment opportunities, men now have a dual career track where they can become a head coach in men's athletics or women's athletics, where that is not, the reverse is not true for women, meaning less than 2% of all head coaches in men's sports are women. And when they are there, it's always in individual sports like track and field. There are no women head coaches in any men's team sport like football, basketball, hockey, in a Division I sports program.
That's a fairly overwhelming statistic. And anecdotally, as I've been watching the Olympics, I've noticed like a lot of the women athletes who have been successful thus far in the Olympics, they have been embraced and supported and high-fived by predominantly men. I mean, I don't know that these men are their coaches, but I don't see any women around them outside of the other women competitors. And so that's just something that I kind of clicked yesterday and the day before as I was watching that. So
yeah, and we have not in the Tucker Center, and really the person who's been spearheading this research is Dr. Lavoie, and she's conducting longitudinal research to see if there are any changes over time. But she does not, I'm sure somebody has, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure somebody has, but I know that Dr. Lavoie has not tracked who are the coaches of elite female Olympic athletes. But I would suggest that, again, they probably have the same attitude that a lot of people around the country do, which is if you're going to be serious about being a true athlete, then you better get a real coach, meaning a male coach.
So that whole narrative is completely gendered, and as coaching became professionalized and quote unquote serious, then the focus shifted to employing men in those roles. Interesting.
Yeah, and because you were now going to have a salary versus some sort of volunteerism model with facilities and scholarships at the Division I level, which did not exist prior to Title IX, then men became interested because it wasn't simply about volunteering. It was about a career choice, and they have certainly flooded the zone. And I'm not saying, by the way, that they shouldn't. But the point is, the whole spirit of Title IX was to increase opportunities for women. And so when you hear critics of Title IX complain about how much it's hurts men's sports, even though Title IX isn't about employment opportunities, it has benefited men to become coaches far more than it has benefited women. And in fact, it has damaged women's career opportunities as coaches and as athletic directors.
And I think that this is the refrain that you talk about, where when a group that has dominance in X, Y, or Z, when that dominance is challenged either overtly or covertly, right, the response is often what you're saying, that this has affected our participation. You're limiting our opportunities now, or you're taking something away from us. And so, it sounds like that definitely has manifested in the context of coaching. And I think that it's also manifested in the context of women's athletics, or at least exposure for women in sport, right? So we know that men's sport still gets significantly greater exposure in the media as compared to women's. And yet there's a pushback around when individuals articulate that women's sport needs to be covered more regularly in the media, it needs to have a higher visibility, then the inevitable pushback similarly is, but that takes something away from men's sports. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Well, I do actually have an opinion on that. I've spent 30 years of my career looking at the very topic of media coverage of women's sports. Yes, I think that, again, sport, as we all know, has been an institution that historically has been deeply identified with men and maleness and masculinity. And whenever a majority group, in this particular case men, has a stranglehold on an institution, especially one that is not only as ubiquitous and powerful and glorified and worshipped like sports, but also, as I said, deeply identified with maleness and masculinity, the majority group doesn't wake up one morning and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We're monopolizing all the resources and power and prestige in this particular institution. We need to give 50% of it to women. That's not how social change happens. And so Title IX has been a significant piece of federal civil rights legislation that advocates of women's sports could use to force schools who were not interested in taking women's sports seriously. They could force these schools legally to provide resources to women. And so what Title IX has allowed to happen over the last 2 generations, because last summer we celebrated the 45th anniversary of Title IX, excuse me, is that after decades of being told that women aren't any good at sports and aren't interested in sports, I'm really sorry again. I hope you can edit this out, although I don't know. But at any event, after decades of being told that women aren't any good at sports or wouldn't be interested in sports, we built them a ballpark in the United States, and they have overcome in overwhelming numbers. And so what that means is that we've gone from, prior to Title IX, 1 in 27 girls playing high school sports to 1 in basically 1. Prior to Title IX, 0 scholarships at the Division I level for women. Now 43% of all scholarship athletes in this country are female. So what then do you do about media coverage? Whereas before, sports writers and editors weren't under any pressure to cover women's sports, really, except the occasional Billie Jean King sort of situation. There was no pressure to cover women's sports because there weren't any women's sports. But now what do you do after women have penetrated this sacred all-male space in overwhelming numbers? Do you continue to deny the reality that women are deeply interested in sports and, hey, by the way, are pretty good at sports? And the media have done just precisely that. They have continued to ignore women's sports. And so again, even though 40% of all sports participants are female and 43% of all scholarship athletes in this country are female, they still only receive about 3 to 4% of all media coverage. And then within that 3 to 4%, they are far more likely than male athletes to be portrayed off the court, out of uniform, and in highly sexualized poses. And I would suggest to you and to your listening audience that the result of that is to marginalize and trivialize female athletes as athletes, and certainly to trivialize their accomplishments as highly gifted, competitive athletes with fabulous athletic bodies.
So what kind of, what are you seeing in your research in terms of the last part of what you just stated around the sexual objectification of girls and women in sport as a means to diminish their contribution? What kinds of examples do you have that you've come across?
Well, as I said, what the research tells us is that certainly just in terms of quantity, female athletes, when they are portrayed, are significantly more likely than male athletes to be portrayed off the court and out of uniform and in highly stylized and sexualized poses. And I think the impact of that kind of coverage is that when you are told growing up and in a culture that says that females cannot be the real athletes in the way that males are because male athletes are bigger, stronger, faster, when you are told that females have certain limited physical and biological capacities, that they simply cannot measure up literally and figuratively, what then happens, though, when you actually see women, as you do in the Olympics, performing at the most extraordinary levels of physical skill and ability? So you can take what you see in front of you empirically, which is that, oh, maybe we were wrong about what we thought were the limits of women's physical capacities. And how do you then contain that power? Well, one way that you contain that power is that when you do cover them, you emphasize traditional notions of femininity and sexuality, or you don't give them the coverage that reflects the amount of interest and participation. And as a result, you take sport, and I think this is really important, you take sport, which can potentially be a site of enormous resistance and transformation of what we think about women and their physical and mental capacities, and you marginalize that experience by treating them as silly, fluffy sex objects, and that happens in the media repeatedly and consistently, then the question as a sociologist becomes who benefits from that kind of coverage. And I would suggest to you it is certainly not female athletes.
And one of the arguments I guess I run into or I hear a lot is that women's sport isn't as interesting, right? Like that's the reason why it's not on television. It's got nothing to do with sexism. It's got nothing to do with systemic male privilege within the field of sport. It's just not as exciting. What do you say to people who share that perspective with you?
Well, I suppose it would mean what's your operational definition of exciting? The Olympics, for example, provides a very clear pattern of people's interest in women's sports, which is when you provide an audience with an opportunity to see women's sports, like figure skating, like downhill skiing, and in the Summer Olympics, it's like gymnastics and swimming. When you provide an audience with an opportunity to see female athletes performing at the greatest and highest levels of performance and athletic achievement, there is an enormous audience and there's an enormous amount of interest for women's sports. I think that it took me probably 2 decades doing this kind of research because I heard the same refrain that you heard, which is, well, we don't cover women's sports because nobody's interested in them. And then I realized that the referent for nobody is all those male sports editors and writers. And I would argue that there is an audience out there that is very hungry and desperate for coverage of women's sports. And I've also believed, if you accept my argument, that the way to contain or marginalize women's power in sports as they become more and more accepted as female athletes and as they achieve at even greater heights than we ever thought possible, if you accept my argument that women are marginalized through their coverage, then you will also accept that that's a way to deny that there is an interest, that there is an audience, and that as a result, we simply perpetuate the status quo. I have come to believe recently that the greatest concern or fear, quote unquote, among male sports editors and writers is not that nobody's interested in women's sports, but that given half a chance, far too many people would be interested in women's sports, and then men's sports wouldn't be the center of the universe.
Interesting. So it's a protection of their position of power and dominance, or maintaining the space as exclusively male, whether it's a conscious or unconscious behavior.
Yes, and how media coverage plays out with respect to female athletes, which is, again, if you only give them 2 to 4% of all media coverage across the ubiquitous sports media landscape, you reinforce the notion that females aren't interested in sports and that nobody's interested in watching them. And then within that 2 to 4%, if you focus on their femininity and their sexuality rather than their accomplishments, then you reinforce for everyone the belief that by definition, males are the superior athletes because we are taking them seriously and we see images of them expressing their athletic accomplishments and their athletic capacities, and we do just the opposite for female athletes.
And what of the female athletes themselves? Have you done much research into their own understanding of their identity as a woman and an athlete?
Yes. In fact, just recently, again, Dr. Lavoie, who is my colleague at the University of Minnesota in the Tucker Center, and a woman named Janet Fink, who's a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, we did research in which, we said to ourselves, why don't we ask elite female athletes, if given the choice, how they would actually like to be portrayed in the media and how they would like their sports to be portrayed. And so we looked at female athletes representing 3 individual sports and 3 team sports at the Division I level. That's how we operationally defined elite female athletes. And we presented them randomly in one-on-one, semi-structured, face-to-face interviews 4 different images of how female athletes are typically portrayed. In one, the image was of on-court, in-uniform athletic competence. Another was off the court in a posed, sort of silly, fluffy image. And another one was kind of the all-American girl next door image. And then finally, an image of a female athlete as a sexy babe, or often sometimes even bordering on soft pornography. And we said to each one of these female athletes, again, pointing to the 4 images that were on the table in front of them, which one of these images best represents how you would like to be portrayed and how you would like your sport to be portrayed? And a fascinating and unexpected result was that over just 50% of the student athlete participants said to the person who was interviewing her, spontaneously said, "Can I pick more than one image?" Which we were not anticipating at all, but we were smart enough to say, sure, pick 2, follow the data trail. And in every case, the female athlete who asked to pick more than one image always, as one of the images, picked the competence image to represent her sport and her self-representation. But she also then picked the sort of classy girl next door image. And when we asked them why they wanted to pick 2 images, they said routinely, because I don't want to be known as just a sweaty jock. I don't want to be perceived in a one-dimensional role. I am more than my identity as a female athlete, and I want to be seen as feminine off the court. And so we interpreted that to talk about how females feel the need, especially in team sports, to perform femininity. Because unlike males, when you're a female athlete, you have to deal with a dual identity that's tied to traditional notions of femininity. And so that was, I guess, an empirical finding that reinforced the notion that female athletes, even those at the most elite level, internalize all the messages they get about what it means to be a female athlete, but still be pretty in pink.
So the messages that exist in our culture that we breathe in every day are extraordinarily powerful, and in some ways we unintentionally reinvent them, or I'm trying to think of a different word from regurgitate, but we reproduce them based on how we can construct our own identity. Yeah, and you're seeing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that was interesting is that we also asked them 2 other questions, meaning these elite female athletes. We said, which one of these 4 images best represents, which image would increase respect for your sport? And, 99% of them picked the competence image. When we then said, which one of these images would best increase interest in your sports? Again, they went with some levels of competence, but they picked off-court, classy lady, and it was the only question we asked where they also picked soft porn, sexy babe images. And when we asked them why, they put their sport marketing hats on, because they have internalized the deeply embedded belief that sex sells women's sports. And they said, well, we might not like it because we don't necessarily want to be portrayed as sexy babes, but if you want to get interest in our sports, you got to attract the real fans, meaning male fans. And the best way to attract male fans is to make us be sexy and pretty. Now, I would challenge both of those assertions, but again, it gets to your point that female athletes have internalized these messages just like the rest of us have, if not more so.
Years and years and years ago, when I was 16, I grew up in England, and there's a point at 16 where you take different exams. And I was looking at doing a media studies exam, and I remember vividly walking into the kind of open day where I was learning about these different subjects that I could take. And there was an image of a woman. It was an athletic woman, but she was in a particularly provocative or sexy pose. And the instructor was asking us, so what do you see there in that image? And essentially sex was what came out of that. And he's like, right, sex sells. And that, I like this moment, this like 4-minute interaction that I had when I was 16, kind of pulling together these strands of femininity, women, and athleticism, and then advertising and what's attractive and what sells. And it all kind of wrapped around sex. So it's funny, the things that you remember, right? The things that you stick with you for your life. And it sounds like, at least in your research, that's what you're finding, is that these are pervasive and problematic tropes that women are internalizing, even as they're winning Olympic gold medals.
Yeah, and the other study that we did earlier than that I haven't mentioned is, which is again what I wanted to do was to empirically test the notion that sex sells women's sports. And so Dr. Lavoie and Dr. Fink and I conducted a study, this time with focus groups, not of elite female athletes, but of individuals. We had individuals who were 18 to 34 and 35 to 55, meaning two different age groups that marketers in particular are interested in. And we looked at those two age groups. We also looked at men and women, and we also looked at people that had high and low sports backgrounds and sports interest. And we once again randomly presented them with images of female athletes that you find all the time in the media, ranging from on-court competence to off-court sexy babes. And then we said to them, of these images that you see in front of you, which one of these images most likely increases your interest to watch women's sports, read about women's sports, attend a women's sporting event, or to purchase season tickets to sporting events? And not surprisingly, all of the women, the core fan base of women's sports, are females and sort of the dads with daughters demographic. And what we found is that the females across the board, regardless of age group or sports background, and older men, meaning the 35 to 55-year-old dads with daughters demographic, they almost always chose competence as the image that would make them have their interest in women's sports increase. The 18 to 34-year-old males did pick, compared to the other focus groups, sexy babe images more than the other groups. But when we said to them, okay, you've picked this image, but would it make you want to go to a sporting event? And they said, no, it would make us want to buy the magazine, like the Sports Illustrated swimming suit issue, but it wouldn't make us want to go and watch women's sports, because that's not what they look like when they play sports. So they're interested in consuming women's bodies as objects of sexual desire, not as highly gifted, competent athletes. On the other hand, when you sexualize female athletes, you alienate your core fan base, which is women and older men. So in fact, selling sex not only doesn't work, at least with this limited group of individuals, and this study, by the way, needs to be replicated, but you actually alienate your core fan base because you sexualize female athletes in ways that offend women and older men.
So given what you're saying, and I understand this is one study and it needs to be replicated, why then does sports media and sports writers and all of the in-between continue to objectify women and to minimize their exposure on the field, so to speak?
Well, that is, I think, Lisa, that's the $64,000 question, right? That's the sort of sweet spot question, which is, in America, and certainly in sports where capitalism and profit and money is, at the center of the universe, what forces would be at work that would override the desire to look at objective data and say, you know what, maybe sex doesn't sell women's sports. In fact, what I would argue is the same people who are telling us that sex sells women's sports are the same people that tell us that nobody's interested in women's sports. Well, if nobody's interested in women's sports and you've been selling sex, why don't you try something else? And I would, it's not rocket science, just portray women the way you portray men, which is as highly competent, gifted athletes that people want to go and see. So the question is, what forces are at work that would override or trump, to use an unpleasant word, what forces would be at work that would have male sports writers and editors and people in charge of the media go against their own economic interests? And I would go back to the notion that the real concern is not that nobody's interested, but that if given half a chance, far too many people would be interested in sports. And then the whole notion, the deeply embedded ideological belief and practice which equates sports with maleness and masculinity might come tumbling down. And when that happens, who knows how we can put that back together again.
Because its inevitable crumbling would be a travesty, clearly, right?
Well, it means that they wouldn't have a unitary grip and stranglehold on one of the most important institutions in this culture.
Right. Right. And that's just an unacceptable reality. And so, yeah, that's such an interesting point that they're going against their own economic self-interest, because selling sex in that context has actually alienated a significant population of consumers. So it doesn't benefit them per se to do that.
Yeah, but I would bet, to use an economic term, that if you ask any of them if sex sells women's sports, and if you told them that it didn't and that they were going against their own economic interests, they would not believe you. They would not agree with you. They would point to the number of eyeballs that click on their websites when it has to do with men's sports. But of course, what they won't say is that, well, the reason that more people click on your website is because there's coverage of men's sports. If you're interested in your website because of coverage of women's sports and it's not there, they're not going to come and click on your website. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So even though we can show them lots or some empirical data that sex actually doesn't sell women's sports, I don't think that any of them would truly believe it, because they're too heavily invested in seeing themselves as the center of the universe.
Yeah. And just for clarification, when we say they in this discussion, we're talking about folks who are in leadership roles who are setting the agenda for media, and largely these are predominantly men.
Oh yeah, the vast majority of them are men. So,
and I'm curious to know, how does this research that you do at the Tucker Center or of your colleague break down in terms of race and ability? Have you done any intersectional work in terms of those identities?
No, we have not looked at race or other identities. And again, I do want to caution folks by saying these are the first and only studies of its kind that have been conducted, and we do need to have them replicated, looking at issues of race, looking at issues of sexual orientation, but we just haven't followed up yet looking at those variables. But it is research that is much, much needed. And so I would encourage any of your listeners out there to pick up this research and replicate it, only extend it with other kinds of variables like race, like sexual orientation.
Right. And there has been, I'm familiar with a couple of studies that have looked at the 2012 and 2016 Summer Olympics, and then also at tennis, in regards particularly to the way that Serena Williams is referred to by media commentators vis-a-vis white tennis players, and then the ways in which Olympic athletes were discussed and broken down by race. And invariably, women of color are sexualized at a greater degree, and there are numerous racial microaggressions that come up in the course of conversation, but I only know of one or two studies that have addressed that specifically.
Yeah, again, we need a much larger body of knowledge in this area where people are replicating this research and showing consistent patterns across a variety of studies.
So that's one call to action, right? If there are any researchers or interested academics listening to this podcast, then this is an opportunity for you to take up that mantle and further and continue the research that we've been talking about. But since we're right smack bang in the middle of the Olympics, I'm wondering if you have any tips or tools that the listeners of this podcast could take with them moving forward as they watch the Olympics, and perhaps watch it with a more critical eye.
Well, I think the first thing to do is to look at both the visual representations of how female athletes are portrayed versus male athletes, and then also to look at the narratives that the commentators use to talk about these female athletes. So, for example, and I have in the interest of fairness, I have not watched all of the Olympic coverage, but I was struck last night by some of the media coverage on NBC, in which they did talk to us about Jamie Anderson, the U.S. snowboarder who won a gold medal in slope style. And I was aware of the fact, and now again, this is just last night, but it is primetime coverage, and I apologize if NBC spent a lot of time on her actual performance, but they spent a lot of time about Jamie Anderson on the podium, standing there during the playing of the national anthem. Well, okay, that's fine, but I would much rather have you show us Jamie Anderson actually showing her athleticism winning the event. Now, I don't know if they've done that with the male athletes, but I think that would be something that you would want to look at, which is how much actual time is devoted to female athletes doing their sport. And then when they're interviewed, what is it that they're focusing on? Are they focusing on their families, their boyfriends, their children? And how does that compare with what they talk about when they talk about male athletes in terms of their mental toughness and fortitude, their training, their athletic performance? Those would be obvious signs, or to use your word, tropes, to see how female versus male athletes are covered. So just in terms of the overall amount of coverage, and then when they are covered, what are the themes that the commentators are pursuing?
And some of it's subtle, right? Some of it's not obviously in your face, but if you're paying attention and you're watching it over the long haul, you can pick up on the themes and the repetition of these little sprinkles of problematic narratives that come up.
Yeah, and again, it's fine to see Jamie Anderson and have coverage of her standing on the podium during the national anthem, but how much of that coverage then takes away from showing her actually doing her performance as a snowboarder? And then you can do a direct comparison with male snowboarders and to see how much coverage they get and what kind of coverage they get. So that would be a huge lens, if you will, for your listeners to take as they're watching the Olympics. Again, very subtle, because of course you would say that the coverage of Jamie Anderson was very positive. Yeah, okay, but standing on a podium or being engaged in her sport as a highly elite athlete.
And then what advice do you have for our listeners who do this? They watch the Olympics, maybe they notice some things that feel a little problematic, and they mention it to a friend and they say, hey, did you notice that there's this discrepancy in the way that women athletes are being talked about and portrayed vis-a-vis men who are performing in the same sport, and their friend or family member tells them that they're overreacting and that it doesn't mean anything and that they're being too sensitive?
Well, I think what you can do is say, well, why don't we just imagine the reverse? Why don't we imagine the young man whose name I've forgotten, who's the 17-year-old who was the first American to win a gold medal in these Olympics, and he was a snowboarder, to say, let's just imagine in reverse what would happen if the only time we saw any coverage of him was standing on the podium, but we actually never saw him on the slopes, and yet the opposite was true for females. Just ask them to imagine what it would be like if the reverse were true, and how they would feel about that. On the other hand, sometimes you're just never going to win these arguments, but that doesn't mean that you can't take what you have seen, and if you're somebody who's engaged in social media, put it on social media and get a discussion started in terms of the ways in which the coverage of female and male athletes at the Olympics is deeply and highly gendered.
That's great advice. I think sometimes many of us notice the problem and then we struggle about how to take that conversation further, how to engage with our friends and family members in a meaningful way about this is a thing, this is real, and it has consequences both for our generation and the generations who are coming after us.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kane, for speaking with us today. This has been wonderful and enlightening. I think that it really has helped continue to pull the curtain back on some of these deeply embedded gendered messages that we receive through the media in sport throughout our lives, and how it shapes our understanding of sport culture and sport relevance. I really appreciate the time that you've taken and the work that you're doing at the Tucker Center. So folks, if you're interested, please check out their website. It has a wealth of information on there. Is there any final thought for the day, Dr. Kane, that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think the only thing, first of all, I want to say again, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I think the thing that I want to just leave you with is that our work is never done. It's a constant challenge to give female athletes the respect that they deserve, and also the respect that they have earned through their hard work and their commitment to being the greatest athletes they can be. So let's do everything we can to have them be able to at least share the spotlight with men, and be given the resources and, as I said, the respect and the admiration they so richly deserve.
Thanks again to Dr. Mary Jo Kane for joining us today and sharing her perspectives on why women's sports coverage is so limited and why the focus on women's athletes tends towards sexual objectification instead of their physical and athletic capacities. For show notes, including related links and a full transcript of the episode, visit wispsports.com. You can also find hundreds of additional podcasts on Wisp Sports Radio. Subscribe to us using your preferred podcast player, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. For more conversations from the world of women's sports, including blogs, articles, and videos, visit wispsports.com. Post your comments, questions, and suggestions on our Facebook page or email us at info@wispsports.com, and follow, share, and like @wispsports on social media. You can reach me, Lisa Ingarfield, directly at Try to Defy, that's TRITODEFI, on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening and supporting women in sport everywhere. We'll be back next month with another in-depth, thought-provoking conversation.